In 1986, a man stood before 240 people at an environmental conference in northern Scotland and announced a plan so ambitious that most of the room assumed he was joking. His name was Alan Watson Featherstone. His plan was to restore an entire forest, not a park, not a nature reserve, but an ancient woodland that had once covered most of Scotland, back to something resembling its original form. He estimated it would take 250 years, 10 human generations, a timeline so long that no one in the room and no one alive today would ever see it finished. That was 40 years ago. The plan has 210 years left to run, and it is already producing results that the model said should not be happening for another century. In 2020, a golden eagle raised a chick at one of the project's restoration sites for the first time in 40 years. The eagle had not returned because someone built it a nest. It returned because the forest beneath the nest had recovered enough to feed it. The trees made the bird possible. This is the story of the longest active reforestation project in the world, and the strange, patient science of rebuilding a landscape that has been broken for so long that everyone forgot it was ever whole. To understand what was lost, you have to go back 10,000 years. When the last ice age ended and the glaciers retreated from what is now Scotland, forest moved in behind them. Not the uniform rows of commercial spruce and pine that cover Highland hillsides today. Those are plantations, as ecologically complex as a parking lot. What grew naturally was something far richer. A layered living system anchored by Scots pine, some individuals growing for 500 years and reaching 30 meters tall. Beneath the canopy, birch, rowan, juniper, aspen, hazel, and oak. Below those, heather, blueberry, mosses, lichens, and fungal networks so dense that a single teaspoon of healthy forest soil contains more microorganisms than there are people on Earth. This was the Caledonian forest. It sheltered pine martens, capercaillie, black grouse, red squirrels, and Scottish wildcats. Wolves hunted through it, brown bears denned in it, lynx moved silently between its trees. The Gaelic names of the glens and rivers encoded its richness, place names translating to the Aspen Glen, the Juniper Crag, the Boar's Run, names that outlasted any living memory of the animals they described. The destruction came in waves. First, the great clearances for agriculture. Then, systematic felling for timber, shipbuilding, and charcoal. Then, the transformation of the Highlands into deer-stalking estates, which required keeping the land open and treeless so wealthy sportsmen could shoot stags against a picturesque backdrop. And finally, the introduction of sheep at industrial scale, animals that eat tree seedlings before they can establish, ensuring that no natural regeneration could occur even where the oldest trees still stood. By the time Alan Watson Featherstone made his speech in 1986, the Caledonian forest had been reduced to less than 2% of its original range. What survived existed in isolated fragments, scattered across a landscape that had been treeless for so long that most people looking at it assumed the bare hills were natural. They were not. They were a wound so old it had been mistaken for the original landscape. When the Roman legions first entered this territory, they named it Caledonia, Wooded Heights. It was a geographical description. Today, it reads like an irony. The forest that gave Scotland its Roman name is the forest Scotland spent 5 centuries erasing. Trees for Life registered as an independent charity in 1993. Practical work had begun in 1989 with tree guards protecting Scots pine seedlings in Glen Cannock from deer browsing. In 1991, volunteers planted some of the first new trees to grow in parts of the forest for 200 years. The early model was almost naive in its simplicity. Recruit volunteers, negotiate with the Forestry Commission, raise some money. There was not even a nursery at the beginning. Seedlings were bought in and planted by hand in terrain so rough and boggy that a reasonable level of fitness was required just to reach the planting sites. But the vision, spanning 250 years, was always explicit. This was not about planting some pine woods because they looked nice. This was about restoring a specific ecosystem in all its ecological complexity Every species, every function, every relationship between tree and fungus, between predator and prey, between forest and water. That ambition required land. In 2008, Trees for Life purchased the 10,000-acre Dundreggan estate in Glenmoriston, a former deer stalking estate managed for shooting for generations. When the charity took over, Dundreggan had a small remnant of ancient woodland, extensive heathland stripped bare by overgrazing, and uniform rows of exotic commercial conifers. The estate employed one person. The gap between that reality and the 250-year vision was, by any ordinary measure, impossible. The central problem at Dundreggan and across the wider Highlands was deer. Red deer, to be specific. Ecologists calculate that a population density of around 5 deer per square kilometer allows natural tree regeneration to occur. In many highland regions, the actual density was closer to 20 deer per square kilometer. At 4 times the sustainable level, every seedling gets browsed off before it can grow beyond ankle height. Managing deer in the Highlands is not straightforward. The animals move across multiple private estates, and none are obligated to coordinate their culling. Neighboring landowners, whose income depends on deer stalking, have little incentive to reduce the animals that pay their bills. Trees for Life proceeded carefully. They reduced deer on their own land through targeted culling, while opening dialogue with neighbors. They erected deer-proof fencing around the most critical regeneration zones. They even tried unconventional approaches, at one point deploying bagpipe-playing volunteers as nocturnal deer scarers. That detail sits somewhere between ingenuity and desperation, and it captures something true about the difficulty of restoring an ecosystem when its central problem crosses property lines that no single organization controls. The monitoring was rigorous. Permanent vegetation plots, tree survival counts each spring, wildlife transects, soil chemistry samples. It was a program designed to track not just whether the trees were growing, but whether the ecosystem itself was reconstituting. The first decade at Dundreggan was slow in the way that forest recovery is always slow, measured in centimeters rather than meters, in individual seedlings rather than canopy. But the fencing worked, the deer pressure dropped, and then the results began to compound. Dundreggan now supports 1,000 hectares of native forest and more than 4,000 species of plants and animals. When the charity bought the land in 2008, it was managed as a monoculture for deer. A monoculture supports a fraction of that biodiversity. The shift from 1 to 4,000 documented species is not a gradual improvement. It is an ecological revolution, measured in the quietest possible terms, one returning species at a time. But the headline came from the sky. In 2015, a Trees for Life team and renowned conservationist Roy Dennis descended 15 meters down a cliff face at Dundreggan to build an artificial golden eagle nest at a location where Dennis had found the remains of an old eyrie, unused for 50 to 60 years. A tree had grown up in front of the original site. Dennis cut it out and rebuilt the structure. Then the waiting began. Golden eagles require large territories, specific nesting conditions, and abundant prey. They had been seen regularly over Dundreggan, soaring on thermals above the recovering landscape, but they had not nested. Year after year, estate manager Doug Gilbert checked the cliff. Year after year, the nest sat empty. In the summer of 2020, 5 years after the eyrie was built, a pair of golden eagles successfully reared a chick at Dundreggan for the first time in 40 years. The last confirmed breeding had been in 1980. The estate's developing woodland, home to an increasing number of black grouse, a key food source for eagles, had played a decisive role in attracting them. The eagles had not returned because someone gave them a nest. They had returned because the habitat beneath the nest had recovered enough to sustain them. The food chain had rebuilt itself from the soil up, fungi feeding roots, roots feeding trees, trees feeding grouse, grouse feeding eagles. Every link in a chain that had been broken for 4 decades. Doug Gilbert's response after 5 years of patient checking was precise in the way that only sustained hope can produce. He called it a rewilding success story beyond our wildest dreams. But something else was happening at Dundreggan that the textbooks had not fully anticipated. Underground. Mycorrhizal fungi live on tree roots in a mutually beneficial relationship that has evolved over 400 million years. Many tree species cannot survive without them. In degraded highland landscapes, these fungal networks had been largely destroyed by centuries of overgrazing. Trees for Life developed a specialized inoculation program, collecting 59 species of fungi from Dundreggan's old-growth remnants and introducing them to newly planted trees. The scientific literature suggests that mycorrhizal networks typically take decades to reach meaningful extent in severely degraded soils. At Dundreggan, the combination of retained old-growth remnants acting as fungal source populations, active inoculation, and deer-fenced regeneration zones appears to have accelerated the process considerably. The full picture of what is happening underground remains an open question the science is still working to answer. But the above-ground evidence, the speed of tree establishment, the diversity of returning species, the soil chemistry improvements, suggests the underground networks are reconnecting faster than anyone predicted. Above ground, the results were clearer and measurable. 2 million native trees have been planted across dozens of sites. There are documented gains in soil organic carbon and water retention. Species from nearly every category of the Caledonian forest's historic biodiversity are returning or expanding. Pine martens, red squirrels, black grouse, rare lichens, fungi, and invertebrates never previously recorded at the site. The economic model was evolving too. Carbon credit buyers approached Trees for Life proactively, paying premiums because they understood they were paying for genuine ecosystem restoration, not just rows of trees in the ground. Trees for Life directed a portion of that revenue back to local community organizations, the West Glenmoriston Community Company and the Glenmoriston Improvement Group. The restoration was generating income, and that income was flowing into the communities whose relationship with the land had been shaped by the same centuries of extractive management that destroyed the forest. In April 2023, the Dundreggan Rewilding Centre opened, the first facility of its kind in the world. When Dundreggan was a sporting estate, it employed one person. Today it has multiple full-time staff and supports seasonal nursery jobs. The centre includes exhibition space, a cafe, accommodation, forest play areas, and all-ability trails, giving people direct access to a landscape in the middle of becoming something different. But the economic argument for rewilding is not yet settled for everyone. Estates that have not joined the initiative still operate as deer stalking businesses. Their income depends on maintaining deer populations at levels incompatible with forest regeneration. The choice between a stalking economy and a rewilding economy involves questions about identity, tradition, and what kind of landscape the Highlands should be. Trees for Life's approach has been to demonstrate rather than debate, letting the 4,000 species, the golden eagle chick, the carbon revenue, and the new jobs speak for themselves. In 2021, Trees for Life launched the Afric Highlands Initiative, a 30-year program spanning over 200,000 hectares from Loch Ness to Scotland's west coast. Both the UK and Scottish governments recommended it for United Nations World Restoration Flagship status in 2022. By late 2024, agreements with 19 estates covered more than 58,000 hectares. In 2025, Afric Highlands launched as an independent charity. The 250-year plan was beginning to operate at the scale it had always required. At the western edge of the Afric Highlands landscape, there is a cluster of 57 Scots pines. They are the remnant of a forest that once filled an entire glen. The oldest has been dated by the St. Andrew's Tree Ring Laboratory to at least 1458, over 565 years old, and believed to be even older. A tree already ancient when the first European settlers crossed the Atlantic. A tree that grew through the Jacobite rebellions and the Highland clearances and 2 world wars, still standing on a hillside that everything around it had abandoned decades ago. In late 2023, Trees for Life erected 1.5 kilometers of deer-proof fencing around this woodland, with materials transported in by helicopter. For the first time in decades, young seedlings can grow beneath these ancient trees without being eaten. The 565-year-old pine now has the chance to produce offspring that might survive it. If they do, those offspring will be growing in the year 2100, and their offspring in 2200. And the forest Alan Watson Featherstone imagined in 1986 might, by the middle of the 23rd century, be approaching something like its original form. None of the people who started this work will see its completion. None of the people alive today will. The 250-year plan ends in 2236. This is a project of commitment beyond any single lifetime. But the eagle came back. The soil is rebuilding itself. The oldest Scots pine in the glen is producing seedlings that will outlive everyone currently reading its rings. And a forest that Scotland spent 5 centuries destroying is, for the first time, growing faster than it is shrinking. This is returning on a scale few expected. Alan Watson. Featherstone understood something in 1986 that is easy to state and extraordinarily hard to truly believe. That the most important work is the work whose results you will never see. The Caledonian forest is returning. Not in our lifetimes, but it is returning.